The university is no longer just in crisis, it's actively collapsing. Schole IRL is a podcast dedicated to understanding the worlds people are building in its ruins already today. Each week, we explore the emerging experimental sphere of para-academia, with thinkers and builders doing the work to create spaces for communal study and knowledge-making alongside and outside the conventional university ecosystem. I'm your host, Sarah Begovac.
And I'm your co-host, Ira Allen. Together, we're learning each week how to salvage Schole from institutional hoarding and collapse alike.
Join us in reclaiming time and space for something like leisurely thinking outside instrumental ends. Schole in real life. Hello, everyone, and welcome as always to Schole IRL. This week we are joined with Cathy Kemp, Tony Beavers, and Peter Stuber from the Independent Philosophy Institute, now known as Exploring the Future of Philosophy, a group of academics, mostly philosophers, with more than a century of collective college and university teaching experience, greatly concerned by cutbacks to institutional philosophy in the U.S. The founders and members of the planning committee began meeting in October 2022 to think about new ways to support the teaching and study of philosophy. The core idea is to offer small, online philosophy seminars across a wide range of topics, texts, figures, periods, movements, and cultures. It would be administered primarily by philosophers and exist outside conventional colleges and universities, not subject to budgets, curricula, staffing levels, or enrollment expectations. Their hope, perhaps after a startup period, is that faculty could be paid and students could earn transferable credits. A related hope is that many or most of its courses would be free of charge, even if it charged tuition for other courses to raise revenue to pay teachers and cover basic operating expenses. The idea is still in the planning stage, and they are thinking hard about finances, quality control, curriculum, accreditation, governance, and infrastructure, among other central issues. Cathy Kemp is an associate professor in the philosophy department at John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York. She writes and teaches in the areas of early modern philosophy, especially the work and influence of David Hume and the philosophy of law. She received her BA in philosophy at Earlham College in 1987. Tony Beavers is a professor of philosophy emeritus at the University of Evansville and an adjunct professor and visiting associate researcher in the cognitive science program at Indiana University. His primary interests in philosophy have centered around the history of philosophy, particularly with an eye toward reading it as a history of cognitive systems, phenomenology, and how phenomenology might be accounted for by neuroscientific and neuromorphic mechanisms rather than transcendental explanations. He's also interested in philosophy of information and information technology and the philosophy of complex systems. In tech, he has worked on database and search engine design, local learning, associative artificial intelligence networks, and conceptual issues addressing the relationship between technology and human cognition. Peter Stuber is a professor of philosophy emeritus at Earlham College, senior advisor for open access in Harvard Library, and director of the Harvard Open Access Project in the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. In philosophy, he specialized in Kant and German idealism, the history of modern European philosophy from Montaigne to Nietzsche, the history of Western skepticism from Socrates to the 20th century, epistemological and ethical issues related to skepticism, such as fictionalism, ideology, self-deception, and the ethics of belief, the logical, epistemological, ethical, and legal problems of self-reference, the meta-theory of first-order logic, the ethics of paternalism, consent, and coercion, and the philosophy of law. Let's get it started right here with the Exploring the Future of Philosophy team. Hi, Peter, Tony, and Cathy. Thank you so much for joining us today here on Schole IRL. Just to start off, can you talk to us a little bit about how the Independent Philosophy Institute is coming into being and what conditions, whether that's social, structural, or personal, are making it both possible and necessary?
I'd say that what's making it necessary are cuts to philosophy programs at colleges and universities. In particular, budget cuts, faculty layoffs, closed departments, dropped majors, narrowed curricula, and declining enrollments. And we exchange anecdotes about these things with one another as we notice them as they come into the news. There are also some anecdotes where departments grow, but more of them where departments decline. We're doing some MacArthur-funded research. Tony is the PI on that. Trying to document the extent of these cuts. But it's just the drip, drip, drip of news about the cuts that motivated us to do something about it. We want philosophy to survive the cuts. That's the bottom line.
No, I just wanted to follow up on the question just to ask. So there, everybody's unhappy about the cuts, but you all are doing something with
Yes.
that. So I just wanted to, as you're answering it, we'd love to hear more about how, like how you found your way from this sucks, we hate it, it's bad, things that are going very badly, to here's what we're going to do.
Well, I was cut. Uh, this was the start of it. I was cut in 2021 during the pandemic, and started looking around at the state of the job market to move somewhere else. That philosophy jobs are getting quite scarce, and I got to thinking about the fact that as long as philosophy has been a discipline, it's existed more outside of universities than inside of universities. And so I contacted Peter and a few other people, and we put together a group 3 years ago and started discussing, well, how's philosophy going to respond to these cuts? What are we going to do in the short term? And occasionally we'll have conversations about maybe a long-term vision too. Where's philosophy going to be in 20, 30, 40, 50 years? If this trend keeps going. Now, we don't want to contribute to the trend. We want to find some way to supplement and save philosophy within the university system. But it doesn't seem that universities have the same priority at the moment, at least. Right. So our initial get-go here was some concern about what happens to the philosophers that are cut. And then when you start looking at the number of philosophers that are cut, what happens to the philosophy classes, to the students who are taking those classes, and so on and so forth. So it looked like a moment in which philosophy was entering a crisis period. And this was 3 years ago. This was before some of what we're seeing going on in higher education today, particularly with regard to additional humanities cuts. And that's exacerbated the concern that we had. And then even though we haven't talked much about this, too, the concern about AI being in the classroom. So how do we reinvent a space that's going to allow for philosophy to survive in the way that it best thrives and survives? And this is in small conversational components where qualified philosophers meeting with students to guide them one-on-one or in small groups. So we were kind of worried about maybe philosophy thriving in big universities, but in these large enrollment classes where you have 300 students taking an ethics class or what have you, and started to get concerned about what this meant for the quality of philosophy in terms of being able to change the lives of the students that are in those classes. I mean, if you're one student in a class of 300, you have to work to get something out of it. If you're one student in a class of 12, it comes a little easier. There's a little bit more motivation in there. So that kind of was the guiding idea, at least initially, that got us started. And I thankfully paired up with some very practical people that are concerned about giving credit and how are we going to pay for this and these kinds of things. And we started talking 3 years now, and finally reached a point where I think it's time to make the idea public. We have done I think, a pretty good job of building a community quickly. We're still trying to get this off the ground, but at the moment we have a planning committee of 5. We have a lawyer on staff. We've got a resource group of 4 or 5 people. We've got 25 volunteers waiting in queue that we're trying to catch up with to do that, and 200 people that are signed onto a mailing list after one mailing to follow us. So I don't know if I may be answering too many questions here at once.
And I would answer that question in sort of a bookending way. I was not cut, and I have been existing and am still existing inside a here in the first quarter of the 21st century philosophy department in a public university. It's a public urban university in Manhattan. I see week in, week out, month in, month out, year in, year out, the effects of the pressures internal and external, on our curriculum, our course offerings, our students' lives, the constraints that their financial aid puts on the kind of schedules they can construct, the kind of advice they get, and this is on top of, in my case, the sort of regular pressures that my students face, having caregiving, commuting, working themselves, and so on. We, I think, are offering like 25 or 30% of the electives we used to offer. The courses are almost entirely service courses, which is for the place I'm at. The philosophy major was only restored 15 years ago, after the austerity in New York saw all those programs eliminated. So for us, this is a real backslide, and for these students, it's tragic. I mean, it turns out that with this population, those small groups that Tony mentioned, that's the perfect context in which to introduce people who wouldn't otherwise encounter these kinds of texts and these kind of conversations to them, and to a much broader horizon than they traditionally in their schooling encounter. And so for me, it's like the same problem without the personal employment precarity.
Let me build on those two answers. They both remind me we're trying to appeal to different kinds of philosophers to teach the courses that we will eventually offer. Some are existing philosophy professors who have jobs but can't teach a particular course, for example, a small seminar at their current institution because the current institution expects larger enrollments. Another is the kind who has been cut because of financial exigency at their prior institution, involuntarily cut. They still want to teach. And another kind is a retired professor. I'm in the other category. I'm retired. It turns out I took early retirement, but by now I would have been retired for other reasons. And so there are philosophers who want to teach, but don't have the opportunity to teach what they want to teach. And of course, there are students of many kinds who would like to take courses. Some are at existing institutions that don't offer a course in a particular topic that we might be able to offer, and their institution does not. There are retired people, there are autodidacts, there are unenrolled students, or students who, for different reasons, must work remotely and can't attend classes. So we want to appeal to a variety of philosophy teachers and a variety of philosophy students. And I should just go back to the beginning. You asked what makes this necessary and what makes it possible. What makes it possible is online teaching. We learned that during the pandemic. And we're not saying it's superior to face-to-face teaching. In fact, I think we all believe it's not, but it's better than nothing. And the alternative, in many cases, is nothing.
This kind of leads into maybe going back even one step further, which is if you could all just say maybe really briefly, what is the Independent Philosophy Institute? And what does it mean to create a scholarly community in the kind of space that you're building?
Well, first of all, it's a future thing. It's a phantom. We haven't built it yet, but we're building it. And one of the chief properties is that it will be nonprofit. It will be administered primarily by philosophers. It will focus on philosophy, but in principle, we could partner up with similar projects in other disciplines. And it will offer courses, and it might also offer public talks. And if it offers courses, most of them, maybe all of them, will be small seminars. Those are the kind we think are most effective at teaching philosophy. But maybe there'll be good reason to offer some larger courses. That's still on the drawing boards. But it'll be a teaching institution or a place where you can take courses or attend public talks about philosophy.
And this may in part be necessitated too by partial cuts. When a department might lose a few lines and increase enrollments in classes. So is philosophy served, or is ethics served, if it's being delivered by one professor and 4 TAs to a class of 300? Does this even do what philosophy is supposed to do? I've taught in that environment. I've talked to other people in that environment. It's necessary that we do that. But it seems also strange that there are plenty of philosophers such that we don't have to do that. It's an institutional problem that is pushing teaching talent out of the universities in this process, and in a discipline where conversational dialogue, pardon me for the restatement there, but in a discipline where conversation is key, damage can be done to profession by increasing enrollment. So when we started meeting together too, we were talking about, well, helping philosophy survive is not just a matter of making up lacks of courses, but also getting the course divided so that more students could take smaller classes. And the sad, I'll restate this, the sad kind of situation is that we have the talent in the profession to deliver philosophy correctly, but we have institutional pressures in conventional universities that are pushing against the right way to teach philosophy. I hope I could say that without overstating. Cathy or Peter, if you think I'm overstating that, please correct me.
You're not overstating it at all. It's one thing for a course to be dropped outright. It's another thing for a department to feel pressure to replace small seminars with large intro courses. That both are happening. But when departments replace concentrated specialized seminars with large intro courses, the department loses depth. The philosophy students of that institution lose depth. And when depth is sacrificed, then philosophy itself is losing something important. We want both breadth and depth. We don't want to see depth lost. We want to offer the small seminars that philosophy needs.
And in a sense, my arrival at this work and joining this group, it's funny given the frame that you guys have for the podcast. Like, here's a new space. How do you conceive the new space? How are you thinking about the new space? And I have I'm trying to think, am I doing this in bad faith? Because so much of what I feel like my interest is in relation to our project is conservative, restorative, preservative. I have all these images of like refugees and seed banks and all kinds of sort of overly dramatic and unduly emotionally laden images for my relationship to philosophy now, in response to the kind of pressures that Peter and Tony are talking about. But, and they're multiplied in their variety, right? So from the inside, early on, I would say assessment, right, which was weaponized, if I can use that language, in the K through 12 system, in its platforming to the higher ed culture, was one of the most significant wedges that higher ed administrators would use to cut down on course variety, cut down on the depth and the breadth that Peter's talking about, to increase enrollments, to cut faculty members, to shift the proportion of full-time tenured to contingent faculty, which then, of course, undermines the academic and disciplinary self-determination, to put pressure on departments to drop courses that had been recently developed in response to growth in the discipline, right? So for me, the IPI is a place to, have somebody like Peter Adamson come teach Plotinus, but also to keep that Latin American philosophy class and that indigenous philosophy class that my colleague Sergio Gallegos just developed. So it's like we're losing all of these things on the inside at my place. Both the traditional I guess you could call, canonical figures and texts and so on, but also the more neglected in that list, as well as the courses that my colleagues across the discipline, right, have developed in response to growth in the discipline, subject matters, interest topics, peoples, cultures, the planet, etc. The IPI for me is a way to preserve that, but I feel like a conservator. I'm like a museum curator, like, hiding in a back room, shutting out. And so a lot of it is, for me, it's still negative. It's still a negative reaction. Like, oh, whatever it is, it's not accreditation. It's not assessment. It's not the kind of financial pressure. So when Peter talks about independence, in a sense, that's the most important word after philosophy, are all the different ways we can imagine independence. But for me, a lot of that is by contrast. And so in a sense, still impoverished, I guess.
And I think, Cathy may excuse herself as overstating, but I think the seed bank metaphor, which she has used for us in the past, is very apt in this circumstance. And we see problems in the immediate climate that we see them, but if things continue the way they're going, what is philosophy going to look like in 30 years? What are universities going to look like in 30 years? And if we're already seeing things like courses in Plotinus disappearing, and these courses in indigenous philosophy, Caribbean philosophy, so on and so forth disappearing, where do they go? Do we just drop this and leave it to hobbyists to pick it up? Or is it the responsibility of a discipline with a 2,500-year legacy to find a way to preserve itself in a new information space as it's evolving.
And I should say, y'all are running through open doors with us with the seed bank metaphor and thinking about salvage. I mean, a lot of what we're most interested in terms of newness isn't necessarily novelty qua novelty, but it's what kinds of new social forms, institutional forms allow us to salvage this moral insight about how to spend resources that is Schole.
Well, and that's the concern, right? I mean, are you universities being responsible to education? Are they not following the path of healthcare in the United States, where we're creating a product with a product mentality and a consumer, and losing interest in, say, the quality of healthcare or the quality of education delivery? In fact, I have a colleague who frequently will use the word educational malpractice to talk about institutions that become so assessment driven and following, these metricized lines that the real philosophy of philosophy is stepping way back in the background. You have to give the 4 things you think you're going to get to your students. 3 of them are coming from some generic gen ed package. One of them might be to teach kids critical thinking skills or something like this. And that really undersells all of the multifaceted reach that philosophy has. So as we're watching this happen, not only are the cuts happening, but the way that universities understand philosophy inside of the curriculum is suffering. And as a consequence, the students aren't getting a good philosophy experience in these large enrollment classes. And we top this off by noting, this is a common thing I think most philosophy professors would say, that when we get the senior that comes in and takes their first philosophy class, we often hear them say, I wish I would have known this was a discipline when I was a freshman, because if I knew then, I would have taken several more classes along the way. Well, this is a sign that there's a whole branch of inquiry. I would say a significant branch. Maybe other people don't think philosophy is as significant, but a significant branch of Wissenschaft, I would pick the German word here, that's losing representation inside of these institutions. So, and it's not just philosophy. Of course, the humanities are doing the same thing here too, but it's quite clear that the direction of the universities are not on the same conservative, preservative path that we're wanting to see. What does that look like? What does that do to the depth of human knowledge? What does that do to the bigger questions about what do we need to address as a species for finding a valuable way of assembling ourselves? What have you? We can't just let go of these big questions and turn everything over to the exigencies of a job market and an economy with no plan for development, right? Just to see what it happens to produce. So the necessity of independence, to underscore what Cathy was saying here, seemed absolutely necessary to us right at the outset. We don't think, initially at least, we've pushed this away, that the same idea is carried through if, say, a major university were to come along and say, why don't you bring the IPI to us and we'll become world university, world university delivering your product. If we do that, we lose the autonomy over the discipline. And I can think of some very good reasons as to why this happens, coincidentally with the glut of administration. So what seems to happen is say you have one discipline with its own oversight, you can do certain things. But if you have 2 disciplines, say philosophy and English, we'll just put those together, and you hire a chair to oversee both philosophy and English, what they have to do then is find some common ingredient between the 2 of them. And as you go up and up, then you get a humanities chair that's overseeing all of these. They got to come up with a common narrative for all of the humanities. Now take it up to the dean level. I need a common narrative for social science, natural science, humanities, and stuff that all fits together. And every time we move up to a level of abstraction in this institutional context, the details for any specific discipline are pushed to the side. I don't think philosophy is the only discipline here. Certainly, it's not the only discipline that's going to claim it's losing its depth. I think English departments could make a very similar case, cultural studies across the board, foreign languages, and so on and so forth. History. in fact, too.
Yes, actually, we're not saying philosophy has been singled out or has been cut back further than other fields. We're just saying it's our field and we don't want it to happen to our field. So we want to save our field. But while we notice cuts to philosophy, we also notice cuts to other fields, especially in the humanities. And often the cuts to these different departments are for the same reason. And so we hope other disciplines do roughly what we're doing. But we're focusing on philosophy because we're philosophers.
And I just as an addendum to this, it isn't that this notion of like focusing on the discipline, our discipline, to preserve it. I don't think any one of us or anyone that we are planning with and working with is has any opposition whatsoever to interdisciplinary work and to the really interesting growth that all of our disciplines have seen over the last many decades in the increase of interdisciplinary work and the emergence of really robust interdisciplinary programs, like geography departments, when they're not like narrowly quant sort of grant only driven kind of sciencey geography departments, really interesting sort of theory, rhetoric departments, just really interesting interdisciplinary stuff, which we're also losing the breadth and depth, a variety of, because they're not seen as, they're even less, you can parse them even less easily for vocational value. It's not there. So we're losing that as well. So I want to just, as an addendum, we're focusing on discipline and disciplines, but I mean, it's not out of a sense that interdisciplinary work itself or interdisciplinary interests are problematic at all.
No, in fact, we expect to see people who work in multiple disciplines. And by the way, this is tricky in a conventional university. I'm an example of that myself. I have a tech background. I could easily be teaching in informatics and in philosophy, but you don't find that combination very often. Maybe a little more today than 20 years ago, but even today, it's around in maybe a couple dozen institutions, maybe, where they're saying we're going to do genuine interdisciplinary work. And I think it's worth pointing to the side as I say that, even that a lot of the interdisciplinary work that's being done isn't genuinely interdisciplinary. I find this surprising when we talk about interdisciplinarity, because if you're dealing with people from another discipline, you do have to talk for a long time to get on the same page, the terminology on the same page, to start to address the same set of problems, to drop biases and prejudices that come from the disciplines and what have you. And that's not what we're doing anyway in the conventional universities. We're interdisciplinarity in conventional universities often amounts to, hey, I've got a friend over in the physics department, I'm in philosophy, we have a kind of common interest, let's write a paper together, and we'll throw it together. I don't want to make that too casual. You can do careful work here, but we'll write the paper and push it out. But what we're not going to do is take a year or two, right, to try to find some kind of common ground between these disciplines that can help all the disciplines, right, be about the same thing, help us address the same set of problems in a common language that we can all understand, and what have you. So within the institution, certainly we will have people that have a physics background that are also philosophers, or political science background that are also philosophers, or as with these two here, law degrees and also philosophers, right? So it may give us a better avenue to interdisciplinarity than conventional universities give us. I kind of think it does.
Add on to that, if you wanted to offer an interdisciplinary course at a conventional school, you might be hitting the wall that there is no slot for one. I'm interested in medical consent. If I wanted to teach a course on medical consent that took the medical side seriously, my philosophy department might say, there's no room for that here. That's not in our standard curriculum. In other words, we already have a standard curriculum and it's not part of it. Or if there's a slot for a seminar on some novel topic, it has to have an enrollment of 7 or 10 or something like that. And if this one doesn't, then it loses. The IPI gets around those problems because it's not limited to the curriculum of a given school, to the faculty of a given school, to the budget of a given school, or to the enrollment expectations of a given school. We can offer anything that we consider to be philosophy.
And in fact, early on, we were addressing this. One of the first things to be cut in a philosophy department, in fact, so common that you don't find it in many philosophy departments, is medieval philosophy. But there's inevitably a few students around that want to study it. There may be 2 at this university, 4 at this university, another couple here, and if we can pull them from multiple universities, we can have a class. We can offer it. It makes good sense to me why a university might not want to offer medieval philosophy for 2 students, but if we can find 12 students, right, and put them in that medieval philosophy class, we've solved that problem. And we could do this across the board for all of these things that are being cut because they're either not mainstream or they don't meet the mission of general education, or the curriculum has to be limited because it's a small department, whatever the case may be.
Or simply from low demand. We hope to offer important courses, well taught, that happen to have low demand. One reason why a teacher at an existing school who has not lost their job might want to teach for the IPI is that they want to teach a specialized seminar with low demand. It's a pet interest of theirs. It's one topic they don't want to get lost. I have many of those myself.
I won't elaborate on that. And I would just add to that some of us, I mean, the problem of the employed person wanting to teach for the IPI is probably going to have a smaller population than either the retired population or the the affirmatively unemployed set of instructors. But I will say that, so one of the things that we talk about is this question about whether or not people who are teaching for the IPI will be paid or not. And one of the sources of capital, as it were, is the pretty significant population of people who don't need for financial reasons to be remunerated for their teaching, but who would nonetheless like to be teaching. And this is primarily the retired population in one form or another, which is substantial. It's still here with us. And a lot of them sort of fled the university that we're characterizing as inhospitable to philosophy. There's quite the cohort there who would be willing to show up and teach these small classes many of them in the kinds of subjects that don't necessarily fit into the curriculum so easily or aren't taught as often. And for people like me, if I ever wanted to teach for the IPI, it's actually really great, the idea of being able to teach without remuneration, because if I get paid outside my salary, I have to fill out some huge ethics thing for New York State, and it's like a crisis. I mean, because they think I'm committing fraud, like Sheldon Silverstein or something. And it's actually this idea of not having, somebody not interfering with my salary situation and being able to volunteer is that's a benefit for me.
But I do want to say at the same time, but Cathy and Peter here have addressed the unpaid professors. We do hope to find a way to pay the philosophers that need to be paid, younger philosophers that might be coming out. And we do have we've talked a lot about retirees, but we are considering the situation that graduate students that are getting ready to graduate from graduate school and go look for a philosophy job might be in as well. And so we're looking for, and we don't have one yet, but we're looking for some type of funding model that will allow this, with some confidence, perhaps, that because we're not a brick and mortar and we don't need these large administrations and so on and so forth, that we might be able to get tuition that students would pay for those students who are paying tuition down low enough that we could still pay professors. We're not going to have the overhead cost of hiring, security people and a law enforcement, cafeteria people, engineers to build buildings and all of this. So it looks, and for a discipline that primarily is conversationally driven anyway, right? It looks like this is a inexpensive way to go forward. Now, that said, we don't know how we're going to fund it just yet, but it seems intuitively, at least, it has to be cheaper than the way that it's done in the big university.
No, absolutely. And it's having those conversations too around that, and just the overall greater sense of salvage of what philosophy is, and responding to that and the cuts and the loss that we're seeing in a variety of different departments, and the framing around what that's going to look like. I like how you mentioned earlier, Cathy and Tony, about the switch from like assessment and accreditation to more like independence, and just different ways of like learning and relating to one another that both preserve the university and also extend beyond the university. So within this planning stage, can you talk about some ideas around learning or thinking or really connecting together that either preserve part of what is being lost within those departments and also extends the spaces for people to engage in those conversations?
I think our main discussions along those lines are to offer small topical seminars or small seminars on figures or texts or traditions. We don't have let's say, an agreed upon philosophy of teaching. We don't want to impose an agreed upon philosophy of teaching on new teachers within the IPI. We want to be pluralist about all of those things. We just want to offer courses, good courses, especially small seminars.
And this is where my sense of being non-innovative really comes to the fore, because a lot of what I have missed in my own career in the various places I've taught are the kinds of classes that I had as an undergraduate in the 1980s at a small liberal arts college with an especially powerful teaching faculty. The focus on reading and writing and talking and analysis and evaluation was intense. It's so intense that like new faculty members would sometimes quit after a year because they couldn't take it. It was really powerful, and that has been something that has been difficult to replicate even in departments where I had a much more self-determination and influence on the way things went than I think most of us do now in these times. And so in a sense, it's like, so Sarah, I mean, and it's exciting what you're talking about. Like, how are you doing the new thing? And I feel terrible about this. It's like, I want to do the old thing because what is old is new again in that sense. I mean, it's like the pedagogical version of shopping in your closet, right? I mean, it's those boots that you bought 25 years ago, they are so back. I mean, that's what it feels like to me in a sense. And I mean, my first year in college, I wrote 35 papers. 35 papers. The first 10 weeks of my college career, I wrote 10 papers, one a week, on a new book every week. I mean, this is the kind of thing, this is the kind of foundation that I wish my students had, that I wish my students who are coming from backgrounds very different from mine. Very different from mine. And when I say things like this in faculty governance settings, which I put my time in over the last, like, for 4 years solid, actually, and until last year, the administrators are, what do you mean you don't think your students should take more than 4 classes at once? They should. Are you saying they can't handle it? And I, just having to justify, oh no, we're not subject to the financial aid constraints. We're not subject to the enrollment constraints. We're not subject to your concerns about 4-year graduation rates. We're not trying to, supply the budgets of all the different sources, of proprietary tech that you've subjected all of us to. We don't have to feed that maw. To go back to Tony's affordability notion for us, that's a whole bunch of stuff. Yes, we're going to need some tech, but it's not going to be recreational tech. So much of what happens at my place is just, here's a new thing that we're paying for, please learn it. And that to me is another thing that carries us away from this very old way of doing things, which is people, books, talking, reading, writing, which sounds so simple and ridiculous, but it's the thing that it's like the hardest thing in the world to get now.
Yeah.
It's interesting as I listened to Cathy say this. Cathy and I were in college at the same time at different small colleges and had very similar experiences with curricula. So the place where I was, the student load would have been a 12, 15. That was it. That was the maximum you were allowed to take. And yet, even in that environment, you could find whole courses on Kant. I took a whole course on Kant, a whole course on Heidegger, a whole course on Spinoza. When the metricization comes in and they're trying to kind of get to some type of commonalities, what we start to see is the curriculum gets canned, it gets tightened, it gets, I want to say, officialized. It has to be officialized so it can be metricized. How are we going to compare this with other courses on your campus and what have you? Or how is philosophy served? Some people might ask, if you have a whole course on Plato, you've just taken, well, Plato's a bad example because who's going to argue that a whole course on Plato is a bad thing? But let's say Spinoza, a whole course on Spinoza when you're only taking 10 classes anyway. And what seems to be not understood here is that philosophy is not, undergrad especially, it's not primarily about breadth. You want some breadth, but students have to learn how deep can be. And the only way you get to do that is to take something like Kant's Critique and you give it to a junior. I know many people say that juniors can't read this. I read it as a junior. Cathy read it as a junior, maybe even.
Cathy read it as a sophomore.
Cathy read it as a sophomore.
I've taught it to sophomores and juniors, so I know it can be done.
Well, and I mean, just cards on the table. Peter was my Kant teacher in the fall of 1984 when I had not yet turned 20, just for the record.
There's an interesting thing, and many curricula you have to be stacked. Like if you're in a calculus curricula, you have to take Calc 1 before you take Calc 2, and so on and so forth. We don't, in fact, have those kinds of constraints in philosophy. Mm-hmm. So you can do something like, and I have done this many times, take Kant's Prolegomena, which is a very difficult work, and walk through it with freshmen and sophomore. And if you're doing 7 pages a week, going through this 90-page book, and you get to the end of it, their understanding and their transformation is massive. But if you try to say, well, they only read 90 pages through the course of the semester, administrator may say, that's not enough. You're not assigning enough work. Well, the amount of work you're assigning depends on how difficult it needs to be, and what have you. It's also been kind of interesting to watch some of these changes, and I haven't looked at the statistics recently, but when Cathy and I were in college, we wrote twice as much as students are writing now, and we read more than twice as much. And we didn't have word processors. We were pulling out yellow pads and writing longhand, and we had to type it, and you were allowed 3 errors per page if you were typing it, or you had to throw it away. And you walk through the dorm, and you see people typing, and wrecked pages that were pulled out of the typewriter because they hit error 4 and what have you. And when I think about this, how did we manage to write twice as much without the technology that students have today? How did we manage to read more without the technology that students have today, and get more of a deep sense of philosophy? I think it was a deeper sense of philosophy than at least my students were getting at the small college I just came from.
And you had to walk uphill in the snow both ways.
Yeah. No, I do worry about this too. I mean, are we romanticizing a little bit here? I don't think so. I have to say, I went to an undergrad college that had 2,000 students, and there were 30 philosophy majors that were seniors in my senior year. Okay, so the philosophy program, if I had to guess, out of 2,000 students, was about 100, 150 students. We see nothing like that now, and I think it's perhaps tied to the fact that it's hard for students to appreciate philosophy when they step in and take a 300 seat ethics class, or they take let's cover all of the philosophers from Plato to Sartre in one semester. In fact, that was the title of my undergrad philosophy, but from Plato to Sartre, my freshman level thing. And you're getting this it's almost a cartoonish caricature of the history of philosophy. That's not enough to entice students into, like, I really want a sense of the depth of these big questions. And more and more as we're moving on, it looks like universities are not interested in the depth. They're interested in the credential.
And to make it worse, a lot, at least like places like mine where the students are, immigrant, child of immigrant, first generation, second language, you name it. Philosophy doesn't provide the kind of vocational trajectory that other areas of study would. And so we are under enormous pressure to be relevant. It's the old story. Well, what they don't realize is when you take precisely these students who have no vocational justification for spending a semester on Spinoza, and you run them through classes like that, we have managed it in a kind of a guerrilla way here and there in the curriculum over the last 20 years that I've been teaching. This is at the City University of New York, 2 different campuses. The students have been electrified and permanently transformed. And their options after graduation are exponentially larger. All those things that we know, those of us on the inside, about philosophy, you can take people who have almost nothing except their families and their communities and their neighborhoods, and put them in a classroom and have them read Spinoza or study Chinese philosophy in depth, slowly, for 15 weeks. And you put people out at the end of their graduation, even if it takes 6 years, because they're working 3 jobs and raising 3 kids and taking care of their parents and their grandparents, and they have options that no one in their situation would otherwise have. It's completely transformative. I've seen it over and over and over again. And so even the vocational economic precarity argument doesn't hold up when you actually put rubber to the road on this.
Yeah, I had a similar experience with it where I was wanting to do single person or issue related classes. Maybe you want to do like Descartes and Spinoza, or Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. And I had a dean tell me that if I wanted to do that, he would allow that, but it had to be on my own time. So I was populating courses that students were taking and liking better than the courses that were in the curriculum, but I couldn't put it in my official teaching load. After a couple of years of seeing the student reaction to this, he finally came and said, okay, we'll let it count. But I had to prove to the dean that the students will like it better when it's deeper.
It seems like what you all are talking about right now actually aligns pretty closely with our core concern on this podcast, which is the future of Schole, the future of a certain kind of societal moral intuition about how to spend resources that allows for some kind of slowness in study. And so I wonder if I could ask each of you to kind of maybe elaborate a little bit on what Schole or scholarship, means to you in this broader, capacious sense that's clearly deeply interwoven with questions of teaching and learning in small groups, and how you see the process of building IPI, maybe philosophically, but also highly concretely, as a way of holding space for Schole or making a new space for Schole, what it means to make more space for Schole, and to do so in ways that are specifically to the mission of your organization, independent, what that means. And maybe if there are tensions there that you want to speak to as well, I'd be interested in that.
I'm happy to jump in first here, if that's all right. For me, right, Schole is it's not separate from leisure. And actually, it's the same word. That we start with the notion that education can be engaging, and engagement can be entertaining. And I don't mean entertaining in the same sense that Hollywood might sell this. I mean entertaining in the sense that you can capture the mind of a student. And my goal when I go into the philosophy classroom is precisely to capture their imagination, to hold their attention, to have them stick around after class. Are they wanting to talk about this? Will they carry these conversations out of the classroom and into the hallways, back into the dorms and what have you? And we were seeing, I was watching this, seeing a lot of momentum where if you step away from canned syllabi and metrization and you get the students excited, they learn more. Not only do they learn more and capture more depth, they have fun, and because they have fun, they bring other students that also have fun. So they recruit to build the discipline as well. So for me, it is about finding wisdom. I don't want to trivialize that, but it's about finding a slow pace of continual inquiry in a search for depth. Now, philosophy in its search for depth, it's a lifetime endeavor if you're going to get the breadth too, right? You can't get all of it in 4 years.
That was my biggest regret as a teacher. I had great students. We had a great curriculum, great courses, and the students were so inflamed and so learned at the end of 4 years that they wanted more, and of course I wanted to give them more. We gave them 4 years worth, or in many cases 3 years worth, because they didn't discover philosophy until their second year. Several years worth of a good philosophy, which is still just the tip of the iceberg. And it would be wonderful to have a lifelong curriculum. The IPI could do that. Students are not bound by any number of years. There's no graduation from IPI. There's just one course after another. I would go back to Tony's shorthand definition. To me, Schole, or scholarship, research and teaching, the different parts of our job, are all inquiry. And my favorite form of teaching is to teach hard books slowly, or to read hard books slowly with other people, and to talk about them, and then to discuss them, to try to figure out what difficult passages mean, to challenge each other's readings, but also the author's arguments, to compare them with the arguments of another author we just finished reading, and so on forever.
Yeah, I think it is worth pointing out that we're not just talking about how to reach undergrads that are currently undergrads, but what about the undergrads that graduate? They're not even maybe philosophy majors who want more and more and more, and there are plenty out there. It's not that they don't exist. Now, finding them, enticing them away from other distractions that populate daily life and what have you may be more of an obstacle now than 30 years ago. But certainly, I'm with Peter here. This is a matter of taking difficult texts slowly, but not just for the sake of taking difficult texts slowly, but because that's what entices the imagination of the students. That's where you get them. You don't get them by reading the Prolegomena in 2 weeks.
And I have to say, Peter pretty much said it for me in terms of my actual view of the substance of the question Schole. That's how I would characterize it. The one thing about Ira, the concrete question, the concrete building question. I mean, we are in the throes of the how on that right now. One of the big features of that conversation for me, when I'm thinking about all these various and sundry kinds of students, is the shift, and it's a shift from an institutional college and university system where we could force some students to take philosophy initially to break open this process that we've all been lauding so fervently, right? The IPI in almost any iteration I can imagine at the moment is populated by people who arrive already volunteering to do it, whether it's teaching or learning. So we're not forcing anybody to read philosophy the way you might or have in particularly in places like mine, where students are not naturally going to be taking this stuff unless you've got them suckered into this will help you get into law school, right? I'm just shorthanding this for the audience. I mean, you know what I mean. This shift to I have a hard time not seeing that as abdicating our responsibility to bring this to everybody. And I do spend a lot of time trying to think how am I going to conserve, preserve, restore that baby in this venture? Because and it's a tricky thing, because the other thing about that is that I have, I guess, hopes or fantasies or both, that people who come to this voluntarily will not be as tempted to have the IP, have a chatbot, have an AI, have an LLM do their IPI coursework for them. so that but if you eliminate the students who would do this kind of thing to themselves voluntarily, if you eliminate those who wouldn't do this kind of thing to themselves voluntarily initially, I'm not sure what we're left with in terms of our mission, in terms of who we're reaching. And so in terms of the specifics and the concrete building issue, a lot of the kinds of things I end up thinking about are like, what of this mission that, I'm not delivering it in the institutional setting either, frankly, to speak of anymore. What about this aspect of it that I have a hard time figuring out how to replatform to an independent philosophy institute? And so, in a sense, Ira, in terms of your question about the concrete, all I have are questions and I don't knows. And this is one of the big ones for me. Is how do we, if it's just voluntary Schole, and we can't do some involuntary Schole.
That's a good point. And I think on the concrete side, and I think we're learning as we're trying to figure out how we're going to interface the IPI with conventional universities. We're becoming aware of the issues and the problems. But I have a list here in front of me of the concrete questions that we're asking. We don't have answers for, but we're talking. We have an area of tuition and funding, technical infrastructure, quality control, both for the students and the teachers. What's the nature of the institution going to be? How are we going to fund this thing? What's the curriculum going to look like? What about credit and accreditation? What are we going to do with that? And how are we going to administer the institute? So all of these things are open questions at the moment. We have been talking about them for 3 years. It's not like, we have said nothing about them. We have full documents on most of these, but nothing that we've said it's going to absolutely have to be this way. And that's partly because we want to hear from more people, too. We'd like to hear more from the community of philosophers about what the IPI should look like as well. But to answer your question here about the practicalities of it, we don't have an answer, but we're confident we can find one.
Yeah, we're 5 people on a planning committee with some volunteer help trying to figure out how to build this institute. And it might be a partial answer to your question to say this. One day, we hope to have a teaching platform on which we can offer any number of courses for all the good teachers who want to teach on it and all the good students who want to take courses from it. But we don't have that yet. We don't even know which platform would be the best one or what features it should have. But we are thinking about offering some pilot courses long before we get to that point. And a pilot course would have a minimal infrastructure. For example, it could be Zoom and email. We don't think Zoom and email are enough for the long-term vision of the IPI, but we could offer some pilot courses to test the concept, to test the demand, and to, let's say, eliminate some possibilities, but also to, let's say, prove the concept while we're still building the larger thing, whatever that turns out to be. So it'll be primarily courses and public talks. We can do that now with existing technology without having a sophisticated platform. But if we can build or select the right platform, then we can launch that as soon as it's ready. And by the way, it's almost surely going to be open source because we can't afford anything else. And there's some pretty good open source platforms out there. We just have to pick the right one. And then if we need to customize it for our purposes.
There's something to be said here too about accreditation, and we've noticed this with some other disciplines. So in other disciplines like law and engineering, lawyers oversee the accreditation of law. Engineers oversee the accreditation of engineering. But when you get to the humanities, it's not philosophers overseeing the accreditation of philosophy or English professors seeing the accreditation of English. So it looks as the universities have developed that it's the important idea of preserving the discipline has left the hands of the practitioners who have direct experience on the best ways and what the merits are of teaching these things, as upper administrators make decisions on our behalf, perhaps not understanding at all what it is that we're trying to do. So one of the goals here would be to put philosophy in the hands of philosophers.
One more thing, we call ourselves the planning committee because eventually we plan to have an executive committee that actually executes and does things. But we don't have one yet, and we're not the executive committee. We want to recruit people who have different skills, different interests, different perspectives on philosophy, and who can speak with, say, more authority because they're more representative of the field. So in that sense, we're still one step shy of the kind of governance procedure that we will eventually have.
Did you all get a good response to your announcement in Nose? In the Daily Nose, that was October, I think, when you sort of publicly launched the concept. Is that, am I thinking right?
Yeah, it was in October, and yeah, you make the announcement and you get a kind of a rush of things, and then you make another announcement, you get another rush. So we haven't made our second announcement yet, so we're still trailing after that first announcement. But within 3 or 4 days, we had 25 volunteers wanting to help in these various categories, and we'd love to have more. I think it's worth saying on a podcast like this that if there's a philosopher out there that wants to participate or what have you, they should certainly contact us. We do have a form on the website where they can fill out a volunteer form, and we were logging all of those and making sure that nobody gets lost. And eventually we'll pull all of these people into, I hate to use the word subcommittee, but there'll be some type of subcommittee structure where philosophers are looking at, how should philosophy be accredited? How should philosophy be funded?
Tony, let's call them working groups.
Working groups, that's perfect. I like that better. The further we get away from committee language, the happier I am.
One of our 5 members of the planning committee is a specialist in accreditation, and I'm glad Tony brought that up. One thing we won't have in our pilot courses is credit-bearing courses. We'll just have discussion courses, which, in other words, we'll be teaching philosophy without credit. But we know that some students will want credit. It would be wonderful if students could get transferable credits from an IPI course. If they're in an existing institution that doesn't offer a course, they could take a course from us, take the credit back. It would also be nice if we could pay teachers. But credit for students and pay for teachers is not something we can offer right away. So in our pilot courses, we won't have that. We want to plan for that. And in planning for that, we want to recruit other people who know more than we do or who represent different interests than we do. And then we do that through these volunteers that we're recruiting now. And we will create these working groups on different subtopics. Tony had a good list of them, but credit is one of them, payment is another, and infrastructure is another. And all these things are still under discussion. That is, they're unborn.
It is conceivable too that if universities recognize the quality of an institution like this, they might allow a student to take an independent study at their institution that is delivered by the IPI. So they get credit from their institution, but their institution has recognized the credentials of the professor on the other end. Maybe the professor submits a CV to the university as a condition for the student taking an independent study at their home institution that's delivered by the IPI.
And there are other accreditation workarounds. Actually, our expert Mark Valenzuela has already aired with some of us some of the possibilities. Model on, for example, the credits you bring back from foreign study. The kinds of accreditation you can get with so-called sister institutions or what have you. There are lots of different ways that we can. But one of my big concerns was, you don't want to reduplicate and this is, before the recent assaults on the accreditation agencies. You don't want to reduplicate the damage accreditation has done to college and university curricula now. And I came in initially really worried, like, okay, let's offer credit, but let's not be accredited. And so squaring that circle is it's more possible than I realized. And so I'm a lot more hopeful about that than I was initially, which is good because it's more urgent now. Political control over the accreditation agencies has become quite intense as an issue for us. And if anything, my inclinations are to cultivate the alternatives. And so we need people who know about that stuff, who've worked administration and worked all that stuff out. We need those people to come and help us. So please sign up on the website under accreditation.
Yeah, we have a resource group as well that we're compiling with people. One of our members was a dean of a big arts and sciences college who can help us understand how to navigate some of the intricacies there. There's certainly room for lots of input on these matters of credit and accreditation. But it was reassuring to realize that there's a lot of experiences that students get from unaccredited sources that are credit bearing in their own institution. Study abroad, Cathy mentioned here as being one of them. So there are ways, but we haven't finalized anything yet.
No, and it's just so inspiring hearing all the ways of thinking through this in the space that you're creating for this sense of Schole or thought for the sake of thought continuing, and that slow development of what that looks like beyond traditional educational scopes of what that currently looks like, and for students to learn what they want to learn, for teachers to teach what they want to teach, and for that to be sort of core foundation of what that looks like. I'm curious what, in creating this space and in imagining the future of learning spaces, what your sort of envisionment is around that, or what you're imagining that space to look like, and capturing the imagination of students and really getting them engaged in that slow, important work of philosophy, but also of their learning process, their thinking process, and developing that relationship out.
Maybe to add to that, can we ask, are there other spaces that you look at that people are making or have made that you take inspiration from, or look at as cautionary tales for what you're trying to build?
We keep a list of projects that are similar in the sense that they are nonprofit and offer online courses. By the way, there are several well-known for-profit platforms. We're not studying them. We're not interested in those models. But there are many nonprofits that do something similar to us, and part of our long-term homework assignment is to study them and learn what we can from them. And then once we launch, of course, we will coexist with them. We don't want to compete with them. There are possibilities for fruitful partnerships. We plan to do that. But we have a list of 19 right now. And by the way, one of them is you, Schole IRL. And they differ significantly from one another. None of them is exactly like what we're doing. Therefore, there's still a niche for what we have in mind. But yes, we are not only studying those related projects, we're also growing the list.
And I just, so for example, that one of the people on our resource group is somebody who has been teaching for a few years, and also taking classes at the Catherine Project, and who is able to speak to what that project is like and how it's similar. I mean, this is someone trained in philosophy. One of our colleagues, Corey McCall, trained in philosophy, who has a lot of reflections on the similarities and differences in the projects and those interests. And I mean, I myself am very interested in I actually keep an eye on how they fundraise and how they set things up and how they schedule their semesters and the kind of projects they're doing, because it's different. It's got a different mission. They've got a different mission, and they're pursuing it differently. But there's enough sort of simpatico overlap, as it were, that I would say for me, the Catherine Project's very close to the top of that list in terms of things I keep an eye on. Although there are plenty of others, but that's the big one for me.
I've thrown a little bit. Maybe not comprehending what you mean by like what the space is going to look like. We're talking about small and slow, and I think that small and slow is critical. I'm reminded, and I have this by anecdote, I hope I have this right, that Peter Higgs, who was part of the team that found or discovered the Higgs boson particle, remarked before he passed away that in today's academic world, he would not be able to get tenure, and he would not be able to discover the particle because of the time it takes to do slow guided research. And so there is underlying this something about the value of preserving discovery, just preserving innovation, preserving the ability to think deeply about deep things in novel paradigms. One of the things that we can do in philosophy, is look at building systems that have to stick within particular systematic constraints. So if you look at a philosopher like Kant or Spinoza, there are parameters to the system within which everything else must fit. And it forces the students through the study of these kinds of things, if they go slow enough, to learn how to navigate this kind of paradigm, and then this kind of paradigm, and then this kind of paradigm, to get to a point where they can look at an existing paradigm, even if they don't go on in philosophy, and say, hey, maybe this fundamental assumption in physics is false. What could the alternatives look like? And across the board, it looks like this slow, assessive, I almost want to say enjoyable pace with which we could comport ourselves with scholarship is essential for scholarship to succeed as such. I don't know what we're doing right now other than telling people what's already been done. And I don't even think that's a healthy thing to do with undergrads. You just say, this is what people have thought. We want them thinking. We want them graduating and being able to say, even though I'm going to go on in business, I want to have the ability to rethink some of these marketing strategies or so on and so forth, whatever the case may be.
And I guess, Sarah, to respond directly to your question, the honest thing to say is all I have at this point are fantasies, basically pie in the sky stuff. And if I would characterize, for me now, I'm not speaking for my co-planners here, it's going to be either an online or a mostly online space that feels like a kind of a clumpy, distributed version of the sort of small to mid-size congenial department where you're not dealing with egos, differential remuneration rates, travel budgets, old animosities,
Parking spaces.
department spaces, and that kind of thing, and where the students come to hang out because that's where the fun talk happens. And the particular mechanics of that will obviously depend on the kind of platform decisions that Peter was mentioning earlier. But when I imagine the space, it's a virtual version of the hyper-focused but super informal, socially informal feel of a really welcoming philosophy department. And for me, that means lots of different kinds of people, lots of different ages, lots of different backgrounds, class, race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, you name it. right? It's and that kind of thing. I'm actually imagining a student population and a teaching population that's richer than anything you could get in a brick and mortar institution, just because of the constraints on hiring and enrollment and attendance. And I would like to, because I mean, I constantly have this fantasy inside my own place. I constantly have this fantasy because the students are actually there. I actually have those students, more or less. I mean, yeah, I actually have those students, and I wish we could just do that all the time. But they're taking 6 classes and working 3 jobs and caring for those 3 kids and the parents and the grandparents and commuting 2 hours one way to school, kind of thing. So this is like I imagine this space. So the clumpy, a clumpy, diffuse version of the highly congenial, super comfortable department space.
And I think it's worth pointing out in this light that right now online suggests Zoom or what we're doing here. But imagine 30 years, 40 years. I know what happened to the metaverse last week, but you can imagine that the tech is going to develop, that it might not matter as much in 40, 50 years that we have brick and mortar institutions, because we can be more or less physically present in a virtual space. So we can be online and still have social spaces. I realize that did not work very well for the Meta platform. They tried to do that, but we're also looking at the Pong version, right, of what these spaces might look like in 30, 40, 50 years. If somebody cares enough to develop them. And I think that's my concern here is can we get philosophy into this space early enough so that we can define what some of these, I'm going to use this word, virtual reality spaces might look like, such that they serve the agenda of education, and especially again the kind of education we have where we're talking more than anything else, and you can sit 12 people around a virtual table, raise your hand, maybe they even look like themselves in this space. So online doesn't have to mean the kind of, I'm going to go ahead and say, the sloppy Zoom answer we came up with in a pandemic because circumstances required an immediate solution. We have time to plan what that space could possibly look like. And so over the course of time, right, it may not, we may be able to create the kind of social space Cathy's talking about, where people can just go and see who happens to be there at the moment. Maybe they can find colleagues or fellow students that are in classes with them or have been in classes with them. They can catch up, talk, what have you. If it's anything like what I've seen, my experience with philosophy outside of class, much of the interesting stuff is in the hallway conversations that the students are having outside of the time that they have, where they don't get to raise the questions they don't like. They don't get to raise the questions they want because there's not time to raise them, or whatever the case may be. So in the design of the space, we want to be sure that we can somehow preserve the ability for students to not be locked into these direct conversations, right? We don't want them under a constant clock. Maybe they just want to get in and chat about something in philosophy they don't yet know anything about, and they just want to talk to someone who's already taken this other class, or whatever the case may be. It strikes me that in time, this will be doable in an online space, if it's not already to some extent.
Expanding on that, and the creation of this space for our listeners who are thinking through different thinkers or different scholarship that's out there, what would you recommend to them to read on in designing out the space or in accessing the space? What might be important for them to know, or for them to think about, or for them to connect with? And additionally, I'm curious, how is your own personal experiences and your own scholarship and your own relation to Schole, how is that shaping this collaborative work of the IPI?
Well, that's a good question. I'm thinking as I immediately say this, that I met Peter back in the 90s when the APA, the American Philosophical Association, was concerned with what was going to happen to the quality of journals when they moved online. We were worried about it at the time. I don't think Peter and I were worried. We were trying to sell that this was an unfounded worry. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. It's hard to tell with the proliferation of journals whether the total sheer proliferation of scholarship online has been good or bad. I don't know. Peter has probably a different opinion on that. But we started to see these kinds of problems in the 90s with credentialing as things were moving online, and then moved in the 90s to search tools to bring quality controlled resources to faculty that were online. This has been a long walk. I see stronger connections. I don't know. I'm not speaking for Peter here, but this looks like continuation of the work that we were doing in the 90s, where we were building access to resources. Now what we want to do is build access to resources and instructors to teach those resources.
Yes, I agree. You're not misrepresenting me at all, and you're making a good point. I can't think of any particular philosophers that I would recommend people read in order to understand what we're doing. I don't think we're taking inspiration from any particular philosopher. We're all philosophers with different professional interests. I take most inspiration from, let's call it the open access movement. I told you I took early retirement. I took early retirement in order to work full time on open access. To research and education. I was a tenured senior professor, and I just became infatuated with the possibilities of sharing knowledge freely online. And I've already told you, I think online teaching is inferior to face-to-face teaching, but it's still terribly exciting because you can do things with it that you cannot do face-to-face. And the same goes for journals and for other kinds of scholarship other than teaching. But the open access movement has proved that you can share knowledge without cost and without friction. There are problems to solve, but they're worth solving, and most of them have been solved. And so I wouldn't even recommend that people interested in the IPI read up on open access. They don't even have to do that. They use the internet and they take advantage of what's freely available on the internet. That's all they need to know. And again, if they had a bad experience with online teaching, it doesn't mean they'll have a bad experience at the IPI. But we've all had bad experience with online teaching too, and we hope that we ourselves and all the teachers who teach in the IPI will benefit from that experience. That is, will not repeat the mistakes, for example, in the pandemic, when, as Tony says, we had to pick a solution with no preparation.
In March, yeah, halfway through a semester with transition this week, right?
I agree with Peter. There isn't a particular text that I would recommend. And the resource I'm about to name it doesn't come under the heading of, similar or related projects, because it's completely different. I've mentioned his name already, but for me, and I will say, I have not thought through all the reasons that this is so compelling for me. So this is a semi-formed thought. When I think about what we do at the IPI, there is a spirit that I feel that we may share with some of the sort of ethos, I'm going to call it the ethos, that I get when I look over and listen to and assign and talk to students about Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. He's making podcasts. They're 27 to 30 minutes. He's wading his way through the history of philosophy. I don't know how long it's been since you guys have looked at what he's been doing lately, but he's hit the modern period with, significant time off to get outside the Western tradition to do other traditions really substantively and really helpful and revealing ways. But there's a kind of a seriousness combined with accessibility in that website, in that project as well. And it is for me also a kind of a seed bank. The Without Any Gaps is really serious. He went and he filled it all in. And we actually, in a department I was in back in the 90s, we interviewed Peter Adamson for when he first came on the market. This is like, whatever it is, 2000 or something, when he was coming out as a Plotinus scholar. And he himself personally has a kind of seriousness about this. And he was reading all these, what I heard is we might call it B-list, Peter, B-list, B or C-list philosophers, but more minor figures. He's gone through in this History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps project and filled them in. And there's a sense of the possibility there. Like, what if I had a student who got excited about blah, 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 right? I feel like I can always say, okay, here's a place to start. Wikipedia does that too, but Peter's the podcast has a feel to it. There's a kind of slow, serious, welcoming, accessible feel to it that feels like a commitment to the history of philosophy. It's just a podcast. It's just a start. It's kind of a survey. I get that. But he somehow manages to preserve the sense that you could break it open and spend a lot more time on, Theophrastus, or pick your obscure guy, right? More obscure guy, or person, tradition, what have you. So I guess in that sense, Sarah, I would say it's not so much a book to read, but a place to visit to sort of get the feel of for something that for me, even though it's not directly related, has like an abiding vividness for me when I think this stuff through as an alternate space.
To Cathy's point here on the history of philosophy, we have talked off and on about, how is history of philosophy taught in universities? Often you're lucky if you get a 2-course sequence, maybe, and it deserves more than that. Even if you're doing a survey. And I think Peter, when he was teaching, had a 4-course. I think this is right. You had a
Six.
6-course history of philosophy sequence. You have 5? Are you? Oh, you took
She's
it.
just waving because she
Kathy,
took the sequence.
Cathy took.
I took those classes. One of them was a term on the critique of pure reason.
That's right.
Yeah. So filling in the gaps is a great metaphor here. I think we can capture more of philosophy through this kind of method than would ever be possible in a university setting. And I've been thinking, when you think even big departments with 30 faculty, they still have gaps.
Sure.
So,
and actually, they have more gaps. They tend to have a 2-term history sequence instead of a 3, 4, 5 or more. By the way, our 6-course sequence was ancient Greek, medieval, 18th and 19th, or 17th and 18th century, and then Kant, and then 19th century, and then 20th century. Not all of them were required for the major, but we offered them all. And by the way, going back to your analogy to Calc 1 and Calc 2, Tony, these were structured with prerequisites. So with few exceptions, you had to take them in order. It was a great sequence. And of course, it didn't fill in all the gaps, but filling in as many gaps as we could in a 4-year major was part of the goal. I taught most of the courses in the sequence, not alone, but with other colleagues. And I was frustrated that in the 19th century course, I was grateful that we could build on Kant, but frustrated that we couldn't teach too many of the secondary or minor figures between Kant and Hegel. We had this pressure to jump to Hegel. So I inserted Fichte after a couple of years, but then we were still missing Schelling and Schopenhauer and several others. And this gap filling is exactly what I wanted to do at the time, but also what the IPI could do. Because if somebody wants to teach a seminar on Schopenhauer, we want them. We want them to teach that seminar. We want our students to have the opportunity to take a Schopenhauer seminar.
And I will say that this way of proceeding, the one that Peter is describing, and I can speak to this as a 19 to 22-year-old, as well as my present person self, it actually conveys the gaps, if anything, as vividly, if not more vividly, than the substance. I started graduate school with a sense that I needed to get going. And then when I got there, I found some people who wanted to do reading groups, and we'd spend a year reading, say, Husserl's logical investigations, and then we'd back up and read Brentano's Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint. And then we backed up and read the people Brentano was. I mean, there's a sense that the sort of the ramifications, the leisure for the ramifications. And maybe that's what I was trying to capture with Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. There's a sense that the IPI, done properly, could be a space where it may so happen that nobody gets interested, right, in this particular person for a while. But if they do, there's room and time and space, and going to be somebody somewhere on the planet who wants to do this with you. And so there's more possibility in that sense. There's more potential, and the timeline and the spatial horizon they're big enough with the online space that it seems like we could go back to this feeling like, take your time, learn the thing you want to learn, discover that particle, read all of that guy or that person, right?
Yeah, we would have no reason, because we're not locked into a set number of faculty who are teaching this kind of load with these kinds of enrollments, that someone could come up with whatever they would want to teach, as long as it met the conditions for being philosophy. However, we're going to decide how that will be vetted. We're not going to say, oh, well, it doesn't fit into our 10-course sequence, so we're not going to do it. Hey, you happen to be a Schopenhauer expert, or maybe you just want to read Schopenhauer. Why would we not want to do that?
Exactly. And
right.
Another question we would never have to ask is that really one of the 10 courses that an undergraduate major has to take? We never have to ask that question. If they want to take it, then we should offer it to them.
Yeah, it seems like that gives you also a lot of scope for expanding what counts as the philosophical tradition as part of what
Yes.
I'm hearing you say. And I wanted to say, for us, we're talking with a lot of different people doing a lot of different things. And it's really exciting to have a conversation with you as you're in the process of working out. How exactly is this going to work? It's a really exciting and super cool moment to be in conversation with you about the project. And so I wanted to thank you for making time to share with us and to think out loud with us. And I also wanted to ask, what have we not asked you about? That if we understood the project better, we might have. What else matters here that we're missing?
I guess I'd only add that the IPI is not based on a critique of the narrowness or the quality of teaching at traditional institutions. It's based on the constraints of teaching at traditional institutions. And we're not trying to say that philosophers who teach at those institutions don't share our vision of what counts as good philosophy or good teaching, but they feel constrained, or they are constrained by enrollment expectations or budgets, and they would not be constrained at the IPI. We expect that there are many friends and allies in conventional philosophy departments for the IPI. So we don't want philosophers who are employed and maybe happily employed at conventional institutions to think of us as a threat or a competition. We are trying to teach good philosophy and save it from budget cuts and from staff cuts and even from accreditation reforms that are endangering the discipline.
And thereby making it more accessible to more people, even if initially or in its actual form, we end up reaching fewer than brick and mortar institutions would.
I think I'd like to clarify too, and Cathy has owned up to being a little dreamy about this too, that I think it's fair to say, in case people are initially critical about the dreaminess of this, we don't know exactly how this is going to work out. What we do know is that the question has to be asked. Somebody's got to look, somebody's got to try. Let's take a look and see what the possibilities are. Even if we don't ultimately succeed in building the institution, we will have learned a lot about the structure of the profession and what needs to happen within the profession. So I'd hate to leave people with the sense that we're confident that we're just going to start now, we're on a track, and in 2 years we're going to have an institution built and what have you. We're under no such illusions. We are asking questions about what such an institution would have to look like to address the problems that we're having today. And I think personally I should underscore too, lest I said something earlier, we are not criticizing philosophers that are teaching in conventional institutions. The philosophers teaching in those institutions are not the problem. Again, it's the constraints, as Peter was saying here, that they're under that's not allowing them to do what they would want to do. And I suspect, though, this is a suspicion that if we asked them, hey, are you happy with the constraint set that you have to teach philosophy? Most would say no. So if we can change the constraints to allow us to do more, let's see what the possibilities look like.
Awesome.
Absolutely. It's just so inspiring, the work you're doing. And on behalf of myself and Ira, just thank you for asking these questions and for creating these spaces. And for someone who's returning back to scholarly conversations or finding ways to do that and philosophical thinking, and for all of our listeners out there, just thank you for creating these spaces to engage in this type of work and to let people know that there is someone out there that does want to think along these lines and people do want to engage in these conversations. I think that's really, really helpful as we start to think of new sites of possibility and new horizons for learning and thinking together.
Sarah, Ira, thank you both very much for letting us have this conversation. It was fabulous. You yourself are making a great space.
Thanks for your interest.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
A huge thank you once again to the Exploring the Future of Philosophy team. And as Cathy said, it really is all about books, people talking at the end of the day, isn't it? And when I think about the idea of Schole, I think about what Tony was saying about finding a slow pace of continual inquiry in search of depth, and how that sense of slowness entices the imagination. Or what Peter said about how his favorite form of teaching is reading hard books slowly with other people and discussing them together. There's something special here in taking your time to learn what you want to learn that the Exploring the Future of Philosophy team is preserving as they continue to explore what the possibilities are for philosophical thinking and learning. And we're just so grateful for their time here today and their continued work in salvaging a sense of Schole in real life, enticing the imagination towards new horizons for inquiry and scholarly study. And tune in next week where we are joined with Siggy Yokant, Gary Hall, and Joanna Zelinska from the Open Humanities Press, an international community of scholars, editors, and readers with a focus on critical and cultural theory and a mission to make leading works of contemporary critical thought available worldwide. As an organization committed to exploring new forms of scholarly communication and knowledge production, we talk about new possibilities for Schole, for study and reflection beyond institutional ends. Until then, for myself and Ira, thank you for listening.
Watching as the vortex spins below, you throw an insult to the volcano. Oh, my Lord, is nothing sacred anymore. No.
Thank you to Devin Church for making music available from his album All That's Solid Melts into Air. For a link to Devin Church's music and other key resources on today's episode, check out our show notes.